Hi there, YouTube friends. This is Jeremy Siskind. I am the author of, this book is so big, Jazz Piano Fundamentals Levels 1 and 2. Playing solo jazz piano, and of course individually, Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 1 and 2. But you can buy them now as a package, enormous, really heavy book. And today I want to talk about a topic I get asked about a bit, which is enclosures, and I'm calling this enclosure madness. Woo! Enclosures are definitely a big part of the jazz, and in particular, the bebop tradition. Enclosures help to center chord tones and make clear which notes are chord tones and which aren't. They can add a lot of color, they can help to indicate style, and they can also help make some interesting shapes in your playing. So I'm going to tell you about a bunch of different kinds of enclosures, and some that I need to practice that are kind of newish to me. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how to practice enclosures and practice incorporating them into your playing. So that's the journey we're going on today. Okay, so a couple things. So just on a most basic level, an enclosure is when you are targeting a note and you go both above and below that note. Now, it's relatively common for the note above the target note to be diatonic, meaning from the scale. But the note below is almost always going to be chromatic. Some exceptions always, but man, it's usually chromatic. So what I'm showing you here is an enclosure, and these tend to sound elegant, not classical exactly, but mildly classical. And these sound really good. A diatonic note above and a chromatic note below. Now, one more thing before I start. We almost always go above, below, target note. Again, it's possible to go below, above, but you don't see it really all that much. So here's your diatonic above. This is for C. And then actually I didn't write out the seventh, but it's kind of interesting, so I'll show you here. For the seventh, we would start on the root. Very colorful. Now, it is important to practice these rhythmically because I often hear students and less experienced musicians starting their enclosures right on the beat, right on beat one. And we generally want to center chord tones on the strong beats, on beats 1 and 3. So we want to start our enclosures on the weak beats, beats 2 and 4 of a 4/4 measure. So that's usually the trickiest thing for students is they need to think early. What note am I targeting? And come in on beat 4 leading in to beat 1. So that's why I've written it rhythmically like this, with the enclosure on beat 4 leading into the strong beat. The enclosure on beat 2 leading into the strong beat. I jokingly refer to this as the Rondo a la Turc lick. And by the way, this is in Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2. But this is that exact principle of diatonic note above, chromatic below. You hear jazz players using this phrase and parts of this phrase all the time. By the way, if you don't know what the Rondo a la Turc lick refers to, it's... there's a Mozart sonata where I think it's the third movement is nicknamed the Rondo a la Turc, and it does this exact diatonic above, chromatic below. So it sounds a lot like... Okay. Now, in bebop and post-bebop styles, it's probably more common to use chromatic enclosures than this diatonic above, chromatic below. So chromatic means that we are targeting each note by half step. I'll do the seventh again, because YOLO. So a little bit more colorful, a little bit more dissonant. The rhythmic structure remains the same. This is what I usually practice if I'm practicing enclosures. And this is a pretty good exercise to just go up seventh chords. Major 7, minor 7, dominant. And really get to know how to target each of those notes. That's a pretty good place to start. I'll be showing you some other exercises later too. Now, one way that we can add to or ornament these enclosures is adding what I call a turn. And a turn is this kind of dia gesture. And so on the left side, we have a diatonic enclosure using a diatonic turn. Sounds great, right? It sounds kind of Clifford Brown-like to me. If you've ever played Joy Spring. You have these turns. They're not necessarily all enclosures plus turns. So notice what's being added there in that very first instance is that E natural. We originally had D, B, C. Now we have D, E, D, B, C. And then in the second one we add a G natural above. On the chromatic enclosures, it's fun to add a chromatic note. Right? This kind of sounds like, if you guys know Hot House, the Tad Dameron tune. He uses these interesting chromatic enclosures plus turns a lot. Great to practice. They sound really interesting. They're super colorful. Now, I've been studying a Phineas Newborn solo lately. Phineas Newborn, if you guys aren't familiar with him, is one of the great virtuosos of the piano. And he uses a concept that I have given a name, which is interlocking enclosures. So if you look at the first three notes, they form an enclosure. But then we use this note as the beginning of a new enclosure. And this note as the beginning of a new enclosure. You could make an argument that these aren't enclosures at all. What they're doing is it's just going down a whole step, up a half, down a whole step, up a half. But this is a great thing to do if you need to fill some space on a fast tune. If I'm playing rhythm changes. It's kind of this cool thing where I feel like the ear picks out the important note, like the notes that fit well with the chords, and ignores the other one. So it's both colorful, and you can do it as long as you want until you find a nice chord tone to kind of jump off with. So I think this is just a good exercise to do. It's not really that hard, I don't think. Right, and here you've got interlocking enclosure. So just if you want that explanation one more time, these first three notes, that's the upper, lower, and then target. But then these next three notes also form an enclosure. Upper, lower, target. And it's going to keep alternating like that. So think about it however you want. If you want to think about it as an enclosure, great. If you want to think about it as just going down a whole step, up a half step, that works too. All right, I'm not sure how well my program is going to cooperate here. So let's look at this double enclosure, which is really, now difficult to see, but that's okay. So the double enclosure is slightly different. So here what we're doing is we're targeting that C, and you can see that we have an enclosure in front of that. But then the two notes before are the notes a half step above and below, respectively, the two notes of the enclosure. So we're basically doing a two-note kind of funnel into that C. Right, if we kept going, we can keep going forever. Okay, so now we're enclosing the enclosure, basically, right? And you might say, well, I'll never use this. It's too complicated. But I have this Dexter Gordon lick here that I love. My channel's starting to get too big to do this kind of crap that I used to do of like really janky technology. Oh well. So this is a solo fill. I'm not sure if I'm in the right key, but it doesn't matter. So on beats 3 and 4 of that first measure, Dexter is going G, E flat, G flat, E, and targeting the F. Now, this is actually kind of cool because the G and E flat, yes, it is forming that funnel leading to the F, but it also works with the A flat major 7, right? That's the 7th and 5th. So in this case, like, it's kind of both and. We could probably have a discussion like, well, is he just playing chord tones or is he trying to do this double enclosure? Regardless, I think it's pretty cool, and it does represent this little funnel into that F natural. I'm turning the page now. So, double above. Okay, so now it gets a little bit hard to see, so I'm just going to make sure that you can see the target notes are these, the 1, 3, 5, 7. And we have our normal enclosure. Here it's a chromatic enclosure in front of each of these. But I'm using 2 notes to come above. So D, D flat, B, C. G flat, F, D sharp, E. So. You can say that this is a regular enclosure, but with the addition of like a little half step neighbor tone, right? But it allows us to introduce more notes pretty far outside of the key, right? You know, if you pause too long on some of these notes, they're really going to sound like quote unquote wrong notes. We could also do double below, and actually in that Dexter lick, he ends it, I'll show you here, by playing E natural, D flat, D, E flat. So this was on an E flat 7 to A flat major. And again, you could totally argue this is the 3rd, flat 9, 7th. Oh, man, you can't see what I'm doing. 3rd, flat 9, and 7th of the E flat 7. So you could say, that's not a double enclosure, it's just an arpeggio and then a passing tone. And I'd say, yep, you're right. But I think it's useful to practice some of these really common jazz gestures, right? So that's all to say. I didn't make this up. This is out there in the world. I just love these shapes that these make too. If you use a lot of these, your playing will feel more like bebop. And it is possible to do double from both. You can see that little emoji. We're dead at this point. So tired of enclosures. So 2 notes from above, then 2 notes from below. I don't claim that I use that a ton, but if you want to be a true enclosure ninja, you can use the double from both. So how do you learn to use these enclosures? I gave you my first tip, which is to practice arpeggios with each note enclosed. To me, I think the chromatic enclosure is like the most useful one. That's where I would start. But the other thing that I would do is I would practice 2-5-1s, and I would start with the 3rd. I think I've given this exercise on the channel before, probably like 10 times. And I would start by enclosing the 3rd. Of each chord. Okay, so that's step 1. Pretty simple. This is a G7, this is a C major. Friendly 2-5-1. Practicing in rhythm. 1, 2, improvise around that, but require myself to return to those enclosures every time. And you might try first just expanding on to beat 1. Right, so I'm just adding one note to make it like 1 and. Then expand more. Do you hear I added a little turn in there? Good goal is to get to the point where you can play all of your eighth notes, every single eighth note, without stopping, especially if you're a pianist. If you're a horn player, you might need to take a breath, and still include those enclosures, and try not to leap wildly every time you get to the enclosure. Try to connect. Something like that. If you can do that, then you're going to be really well on your way to using these enclosures. Then I would do it with other chord tones other than the third, maybe the 7th, maybe the 5th, maybe the 9th. That's going to be a really good place to start, just getting yourself in the habit of using these enclosures. Cool. I think that's it for Enclosure Madness. If you enjoyed this, you actually will really like, particularly Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2. This has a lot of these kinds of exercises using enclosures, guide tone lines. If you need to get engaged in a more basic level, Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 1 is for you. And of course, playing solo jazz piano if you want to learn to play solo jazz piano. Thanks a lot, everybody. I'll see you soon.